What should have been a routine 40-minute hop from Miami to the Bahamas would prove to be anything but. With indications of low oil pressure on the number 2 engine, the crew of the massive Lockheed L-1011 shut it down and turned for home, before the unimaginable happened. First the number 3 engine and then the number 1 all showed the very same problem. All 3 engines, for some unknown reason, were bleeding oil, and while the crew tried to come to terms with what was happening, engines were beginning to fail. The chances of all 3 engines on a 3-engined aircraft simultaneously failing was practically non-existent, yet before their very eyes this is exactly what was happening. Stay with me as I recount the unbelievable story of Eastern Airlines Flight 855.
Calling out Mayday.
The early morning sky of May 5th, 1983 was somewhat dull and partly overcast as the crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 855 reported for duty at Miami International in southern Florida. Ahead of them was a relatively short 40-minute hop over to Nassau in the Bahamas. With a quick turnaround being scheduled, the aircraft would then return briefly to Miami before continuing on to Los Angeles on the US West Coast. The crew, numbering 10 in total, would be commanded by one Steve Thompson, aged 48. Thompson, with a total of just under 17,000 hours of flight experience, was nonetheless fairly inexperienced on the L-1011, the aircraft type being utilised that morning. Having only recently converted onto the type, despite his impressive total number of hours, he had in fact to date only amassed a relatively modest 282 hours on the L-1011 itself. That said, however, despite his relative inexperience, he was, on the morning in question, operating Flight 855 in the capacity of check airman, a supervisory and instructional role, which, given his trainee's profile, would actually see him occupy the right-hand seat for the duration of the flight, rather than his customary position in the left. This because his trainee, and pilot under supervision, would be one Captain Richard Bodie, aged 58. Bodie, like Thompson, was already an accomplished and experienced pilot with just over 12,000 hours to his credit. Yet having only recently finished the simulator detail of his conversion course onto the L-1011, Flight 855 would only be his second flight on the actual aircraft, and as such, his total time on type amounted to nothing more than a mere 13 hours. To the rear of the 2 pilots and overseeing responsibility for the flight engineers station was the third member of 855's crew, Second Officer Dudley Barnes, aged 44. With a total of just over 9,000 hours in the cockpit, 2,666 of this time had been gained on the L-1011, making him the most experienced on type that morning. With boarding complete, the head count of those passengers in the aircraft's spacious cabin totaled 162, which, combined with the 10 crew members already accounted for, brought the total on board to 172. 172 souls who, unbeknownst to them, would, within a mere 50 minutes of getting airborne, see themselves not in Nassau as planned, but rather back in Miami, having experienced one of the closest calls in aviation history. Shocked and traumatised by their ordeal, but nonetheless alive, through no small element of luck and simple good fortune. Eastern 855 is a story of procedural non-compliance, woefully inadequate communication and downright incompetent oversight, a litany of failures which so very nearly downed one of the largest jetliners of the time, yet miraculously didn't. Nearly 45 minutes prior to departure, Barnes performed an external inspection of the aircraft and importantly recalled no indication of any oil leaks from any of the jet's 3 Orby-211 engines. Furthermore, he would later state that engine indications during subsequent start, taxi and takeoff were completely normal, with absolutely nothing out of the ordinary being noted. Why this affidavit is relevant will become all too apparent as the story of 855 unfolds. As 855 departed Miami's runway 27 left just before 9 a.m, Bodie turned the aircraft initially to the south before being cleared direct to Nassau, whilst all the time climbing the jet to flight level 230. Both he and Thompson recalled that the aircraft roll and climb to flight level 230 was completely normal and uneventful. Barnes, for his part, stated that he had monitored both pilots during the takeoff and had scanned his engineer's panel for any abnormal indications, of which there were none. As the aircraft climbed through 1,000 feet, he recalled turning back to his panel to regulate the cabin temperature and pressurization. He also stated that he had checked both the electrical and engine instrumentation, and that on passing through 1,500 feet or thereabouts, had called Eastern's operations centre in Miami to report their departure time. Having subsequently completed the climb checklist, he continued to monitor the engine instruments and recalled that between takeoff and levelling the aircraft at flight level 230, engine oil quantity indications remained relatively steady, with all three engines indicating levels of approximately 18 quarts, which, to put this in context, was only slightly shy of the 21 quarts one would expect to see with the system completely full. With the departure and arrival airports being in relatively close proximity to each other, once 855 had levelled off at flight level 230, it was almost time to immediately commence descent. And so at 9:10, just 14 minutes after getting airborne, the crew requested and were cleared to descend to 9,000 feet. As they did so, on passing flight level 200, Barnes called ahead to Nassau approach control in order to report their position and get an updated report on weather conditions at the field. The controller reported a broken cloud layer at 1,000 feet, with visibility of the airfield generally being in or around 5 statute miles, that being the equivalent of 8 kilometres. To the east and south, the ceiling was observed to be somewhat less, at about 5 to 800 feet, with some thunderstorm activity being observed out to the north, thanks to a localised cold front passing through the area. Of note, and an influential factor in the crew's further decision-making process, was the controller's mentioning of the fact that they were number 2 in the inbound sequence of traffic to the airport, with the preceding aircraft being a light twin, some 30 miles or so ahead of them. Over the next few minutes, Barnes busied himself with many of the normal routine tasks assigned to the flight engineer, such as reviewing the jet's landing performance and calling for completion of the appropriate checklists for this phase of the flight. Sitting as he does to the rear of the cockpit, the flight engineer is also the first point of contact for the cabin crew when they come forward. That being the case, on the morning in question, Barnes had also been trying to facilitate their specific requests with regard information on arrival time and availability of passenger assistance for those on board who needed it. These demands of his time, well intentioned as they were nonetheless distracting. In a subsequent affidavit, Barnes later recalled that as a result during the descent, there had been a period of about 5 minutes where he had failed to scan his panel, and in particular the engine oil quantity and pressure indications. The reason for these continuous references to the engine oil system status will now start to become apparent, with illumination of the number 2 low oil pressure warning light on the aircraft's master caution annunciator panel, located just in front of Bodie, as Eastern 855 descended through 15,000 feet. Bodie articulated what he was seeing to Barnes, who was sitting just over his right shoulder. In an instant, the flight engineer pirouetted in his seat and glared at the bank of gauges dedicated to the jet's 3 Orbi-211 engines. He recalled seeing the oil quantities for engines number 1 and 3, those being the respective left and right wing-mounted engines, at about 15 quarts, with both their respective pressure readings indicating in the green or acceptable range. In contrast, however, number 2, the L1011 centre engine located in the tail section, was, just as Bodie had identified, now only indicating an oil quantity of 8 quarts, with its pressure fluctuating between 15 and 25 psi. In isolation, the drop in oil quantity didn't overly alarm Barnes. He stated subsequently that fluctuations of up to 3 quarts either side of 18 wasn't altogether unusual. That said, however, a fluctuation of 3 quarts below 18 would show a minimum value of 15, yet the number 2 engine was now indicating a mere 8 quarts. By his own admission, what did concern him, however, were the fluctuations in pressure. Normal engine operating was defined as 30 psi, but in this instance the number 2 engine was at times indicating minimum values of as low as 15 psi, and that wasn't good. Barnes communicated his observations forward to Bodie, who subsequently ordered the flight engineer to shut the engine down as a precaution and to start the APU or auxiliary power unit, a small turbine engine in the tail section of the aircraft, designed to augment pneumatic and electrical demands. Barnes wasted no time in complying with Bodie's instructions. Given the circumstances, procedures called for the engine to be operated at flight idle if possible, for a period of 1 minute, to allow for adequate cooling before selecting the fuel and ignition switch to off. As Barnes called out the individual steps of the engine failure in-flight shutdown checklist, Thompson in the right-hand seat carefully responded by firstly retarding the number 2 thrust lever to idle. With the applicable cooling period having elapsed, supervised by Bodie and Barnes, he continued by placing the engine's fuel and ignition switch to the off position. 855 was now descending towards Nassau with only 2 of its 3 engines operating, which from a purely technical perspective wasn't going to cause them any real difficulty. But that said, there were nonetheless operational matters which still had to be taken into consideration. As Bodie and Thompson took stock of the situation, Barnes continued to action the outstanding items of the checklist. Which included starting the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. Significant in explaining what's about to happen to Eastern 855 is the additional line in the engine failure and in-flight shutdown checklist, which calls for the associated engine isolation valve to be closed, so as to prevent a situation whereby a reverse flow of pneumatic air from the remaining operational engines back pressures the engine which has been shut down. Despite the fact that Thompson was the legally designated pilot in command and thus ultimately responsible for the entire operation, as part of Bodie's induction onto the new aircraft type, Thompson had seen it appropriate to delegate the operational decision-making to his trainee. Bodie thus weighed up all the options. Yes, they were now flying on 2 rather than 3 engines, but realistically this wasn't a big issue in itself. Nevertheless, to mitigate against the impact of a second engine failure, however unlikely the scenario, it would be prudent to land as soon as possible. But where? Geographically, it was a fact that by now they were closer to Nassau than Miami, by a not insignificant 60 miles or 96 kilometers. But that said, Bodie wasn't concerned about the aircraft's ability to reach either airport. Fuel wasn't an issue, and with the redundancy built into the L-1011 systems, even with 1 engine shut down, that was a given. The issue was time. The weather in Nassau wasn't exactly great, and it appeared to be getting worse. Indeed, in hindsight, although the 9 o'clock local weather report had given a visibility of 4 statute miles or about 6.5 kilometres, with showers of rain consistently passing across the airfield, unbeknownst to the crew of 855, this would reduce to only 1/4 of a mile or 800 metres by 9:30. Still further complicating matters was the fact that Nassau International Airport wasn't equipped with radar at the time, meaning that in poor weather conditions, as was the case in the morning in question, all arriving aircraft would have to comply with clearly defined lateral and vertical instrument letdown procedures in order to get below the clouds and land. Certainly not unsafe, but most definitely laborious and time-consuming, especially given that 855 was only number 2 to land, and without declaring an all-out emergency, that sequence wasn't going to change. Looking ahead, therefore, Bodie could identify multiple issues, which had the potential to either individually or collectively lead to an inbound delay, ready to continue onwards towards Nassau. On the other hand, if he were to turn around and head back to Miami, despite it being further away, he reasoned that in all likelihood it would be the more expeditious means of getting the L-1011 back on the ground. So having articulated out loud his thought process, and subsequently receiving Thompson's endorsement, the decision had been made. They were going to turn the aircraft around and head back to Miami. As the aircraft descended through 12,300 feet, now 50 miles or 80 kilometers from Nassau, the crew requested a revised clearance back to Miami. In response, the controllers at Nassau instructed 855 to level off and maintain 12,000 feet, while at the same time authorised the requested course reversal. Shortly afterwards, 855 was handed back over to the Miami Air Traffic Control Centre, which cleared the flight to climb to flight level 200. During this time, by his own admission, Barnes was completing the outstanding items of the engine shutdown checklist, and as a result stated that he was unable to continuously monitor the oil quantity and pressure indications of the remaining 2 engines.
Eastern 855. You in a left turn now? Affirm.
Okay, Eastern 855, I have you back in radar there. Proceed on a 270 heading. This'll be radar vectors towards Biscayne.
Okay, 270 heading back to, Biscayne, roger.
And any problems we should know about?
We've had a precautionary shutdown on number 2 engine.
Okay, you gonna need any special handling?
Negative, sir.
Okay.
Then, as the aircraft was climbing through 15,000 feet, the unthinkable happened. The low oil pressure light for engine number 3 illuminated, followed shortly thereafter by illumination of the low oil pressure light for engine number 1. Barnes again rapidly shifted his attention to the engine instrumentation, positioned directly in front of him. To his surprise, engine oil quantity for all 3 engines now indicated 0. Bodie immediately levelled the aircraft at 16,000 feet and informed the Miami controllers of their predicament.
And, Miami Center, Eastern 855. We have, some rather serious indications. We have an indication of all 3 oil pressures on all 3 engines, down to 0. We believe it to be a faulty indication. Since the chances of all 3 engines having 0 oil pressure and 0 oil quantity is almost nil. However, that is our indication in the cockpit at the present time.
Barnes then contacted Eastern's maintenance facility to try and establish if there was a common electrical source which could be possibly affecting all engine instrumentation at the same time. In response, they recommended checking the status of the number 2 AC bus. But that done, Barnes was unable to identify anything out of the ordinary. 13 minutes after shutting down engine number 2, with the aircraft now 80 miles or 129 kilometers from Nassau, the realization that this wasn't a simple instrumentation problem came with the sudden failure of engine number 3. With Miami Air Traffic Control being advised of their worsening condition, 855 was cleared to descend to any altitude required and to proceed directly to Miami International Airport for a landing on runway 27 left, the very same runway they had departed from just over 30 minutes beforehand.
Eastern 855. We've just lost our number 2 engine, sir.
Okay, loosing number 2. You still got 2 turning?
Negative. We only have 1 now, and we're gonna restart our number 2 engine.
Okay, fine. We're listening. You're cleared direct. Miami's altimeter is 2989. Descend at your discretion to any altitude you need. You're clear of all traffic.
We need a heading. We'd like a heading to go for 27 left.
Okay. Your position right now is 70 miles southeast of Miami. You're about 14 minutes out. Heading 285. 285 for Miami.
285, okay.
And you can plan a straight-in 27 left. We're telling approach about it right now. Equipment will be standing by.
Roger.
Barnes called the senior flight attendant, Shirley Alexou, to the cockpit and instructed her to prepare the cabin for a ditching. As she left the cockpit to begin her preparations, Bodie, Thompson and Barnes turned their attention to restarting engine number 2. Efforts which would ultimately prove unsuccessful. Finally, 5 minutes after losing engine number 3, with the aircraft still 55 miles or 88 kilometers from Miami, the last remaining engine, that being number 1, also failed, as 855's rate of descent suddenly increased from 600 feet per minute to near 1600. Descending through 12,000 feet and having reduced the aircraft's indicated airspeed to 225 knots, in an effort to once again shallow its rate of descent, the 3 pilots on the flight deck of 855 struggled to grasp the incomprehensible fact that all 3 engines of their L-1011 were now gone. Having earlier started the auxiliary power unit as part of the shutdown drill for engine number 2, it was now the aircraft's sole source of electrical, pneumatic and by default hydraulic power, thankfully providing enough redundancy for Bodie to retain control of the jet. About 5 minutes after briefing the senior flight attendant, Barnes made an announcement over the PA indicating that a ditching was imminent, despite the fact that 855 hadn't yet descended through 10,000 feet. Alexou, assuming this to mean that the aircraft was about to enter the water, immediately instructed the passengers to assume the brace position. Ditching studies previously carried out by the manufacturer assumed a moderate sea state, that being waves of between 3 to 5 foot in height, the equivalent of 1 to 1.5 metres. As 855 continued its powerless glide to the Atlantic below, fortuitously the conditions that morning off the Miami coast were somewhat better. A gentle breeze of about 8 knots was giving rise to surface conditions officially classified as calm or smooth, with waves generally no higher than 12 inches or 30 centimetres in height, with water temperatures recorded as 79 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees centigrade. Under these circumstances, the optimal ditching configuration for the L1011 was found to be landing gear retracted, flaps fully extended, and a body attitude of 12 degrees nose up when entering the water, which would provide a buffer of about 10% to the storm. Under these conditions, the wing engine supports, flaps, and horizontal stabilizer were expected to fail once contact was made with the surface of the water. However, the fuselage wasn't expected to fail catastrophically, provided the correct ditching procedure was followed. Following initial contact with the surface, and before water had leaked into the pressurized area of the fuselage, the height of the door sills above the waterline would range from about 71 inches or 180 centimetres at the forward doors to about 19 inches or 48 centimetres at the aft doors, even with the aircraft's centre of gravity at the aftmost limits. These figures would improve quite a bit, were the centre number 2 engine to separate with the force of the touchdown, actually raising the aft doors by a further 5 inches or 13 centimetres. It was anticipated that as water leaked into the cargo compartments and galley areas, the aircraft would slowly start to sink, with the door seals being compromised between 10 and 14 minutes after touchdown. That being the case, with water now entering the cabin, it was conservatively estimated that the aircraft could expect to sink completely between 20 to 25 minutes after the ditching has taken place, more than sufficient time to safely complete an evacuation. Having been notified of 855's second engine failure, controllers at Miami immediately informed the Coast Guard's district headquarters that the aircraft was in difficulty. In response, a Falcon jet and helicopter were immediately dispatched from Opa-locka, while a second helicopter and a C-130, which were already airborne from the Coast Guard air station in Clearwater, were diverted to provide assistance. In addition, 3 further helicopters and a Falcon jet were placed on alert, ready to respond if needed, while a total of 6 patrol vessels were placed on standby off the South Florida coastline. The US Air Force likewise placed one of their C-130s and an additional helicopter on standby at Homestead Air Force Base, with all of these measures being in place by 9:44, just 11 minutes or so after the loss of all engines. With the L1011 now gliding powerless over the South Atlantic, Bodie again attempted to restart engine number 2, without ultimately having any success. That being the case, in desperation, he turned his attention to restarting the other 2 engines. Yet again, however, despite his best efforts, these attempts likewise proved futile. With the aircraft now descending through 4,000 feet, while simultaneously continuing to proceed through the ditching checklist, the crew decided to attempt one final restart of engine number 2. This time, however, their persistence paid off, as the number 2 successfully reignited and began to produce power once again. With 855 now just 22 miles or 35 kilometres to the southeast of Miami, the restoration of power to the number 2 engine meant that Bodie was able to level the jet and stop its descent as the L1011 approached 3,000 feet. In fact, the power produced from the number 2 engine alone was sufficient to not only level the aircraft, but it resulted in Bodie being able to slowly climb the jet back up to 3,900 feet before commencing its final ascent towards Miami International. Despite their change of circumstance, throughout this entire time the passengers and cabin crew remained under the impression that a ditching in the South Atlantic was imminent, and as such, had remained in the brace position until just before touchdown, when Bodie announced, as the aircraft passed over the waters of Biscayne Bay, that the aircraft would successfully make the airport. And so at 9:46, just 50 minutes after its departure from Miami International, Eastern 855 safely touched down on the airport's southerly runway, 27 left.
Emergency services on standby.
Roger, ma'am. Eastern 855 cleared to land.
Having cleared the active runway, the tower controller notified the crew that smoke was emanating from the number 1 engine. Bodie responded by discharging both fire bottles, and the smoke stopped. Similarly, as ground personnel began to arrive at the aircraft, they too reported smoke emanating from the rear of the number 3 engine. Again, Bodie discharged the 2 fire bottles, and once more the smoke was observed to clear. Despite attempting to taxi the jet on the 1 remaining engine, this ultimately proved impossible, with 855 eventually having to be towed to the terminal building. Mathematically, the likelihood of all 3 engines simultaneously failing in flight was practically non-existent. However, that apparently is exactly what had just happened. The burning question now was why. In an effort to answer that very question, it would be worth listening to Thompson's first-hand account of the events that morning as he later recalled them. 2 points are particularly noteworthy. Firstly, his explanation of how the third attempted restart in the number 2 engine was finally successful. And secondly, the observation made by maintenance personnel in the immediate aftermath of the incident.
Captain Dick Body, Second Officer Dudley Barnes and I, along with 7 flight attendants, checked in for what we expected to be a routine flight from Miami to Nassau, returning and continuing on to Los Angeles. The routine part of the flight ended as we began our descent into Nassau. Little did we know that events the night before would put the lives of our 162 passengers and 10 crew members in great jeopardy. I would like to write that the skill, bravery, and superb handling of this emergency by the pilots resulted in saving lives. This was not the case. It was our mistakes that did. While I give myself a poor grade on performance, the results were a successful landing without so much as a scratch to the airplane nor a single injury to anyone on board. I was the check airman, pilot in command, and occupied the right seat. Captain Dick Body sat in the left seat of our L-1011 November 334 Echo Alpha. He had recently completed his simulator training for the L-1011, and this was his second trip of his initial operating experience. In operations, we checked the weather and found there was a cold front in the area, and the forecasted weather was for numerous rain showers associated with the cold front with lower cloud cover along the entire route. This would turn out to be one of the many things that would contribute to our successful landing in Miami. Our takeoff was at 0856 from runway 27 left, and we made a turn out to the south and then direct to Nassau. We were cleared to cruise at flight level 230. 85 miles from Nassau, we were cleared for a descent to 9,000 feet. The weather at Nassau was a broken layer at 500 feet, overcast at 900 feet, and a moderate rain shower directly over the airport, which we saw both visually and it painted red on the radar. We had been turned over to Nassau approach, which at that time had no radar. We were advised that we were number 2 following a light airplane in front of us for a VOR approach to runway 32. As we descended through 15,000 feet at 9:15 a.m. and 54 miles from Nassau, the low oil pressure warning light came on the master caution and warning panel for number 2 engine, and we immediately shut it down. As part of this shutdown procedure, the closing of the isolation valve to the engine being shut down is required. This would later play a major part into our attempts to restart this engine, and I believe played a major role in the successful outcome of this incident. We were now faced with the decision of whether to land in Nassau only 54 miles ahead,
or return to Miami, which was 110 miles away. In reality, the decision was an easy one. We concluded that we could be on the ground in VFR weather in Miami in less time than it would take us to continue to Nassau, given the existing conditions. We would later learn that the weather had actually deteriorated to below landing minimums in Nassau at the time we would have been landing. Despite this, the decision was questioned, and in response to a lawsuit filed by one of the passengers, we set up the same conditions in the simulator, showing events as they happened in the exact same time frame. What this proved was that a decision to land in Nassau would have resulted in water landing about 5 miles short of the island. We started the APU and requested clearance back to Miami, being subsequently handed back over to Miami Air Traffic Control. We advanced engines 1 and 3 to max climb power as we began a climb to our requested altitude. Almost simultaneously at 0923, the low oil pressure light illuminated for both engines 1 and 3 on the master caution and warning panel. We checked the oil quantity and pressure gauges and they all indicated 0. Despite the indications, I remember that we were only slightly alarmed. We believed our problem was due to a faulty indication and that in reality we actually did have adequate oil pressure and quantity. We called technical service at Eastern and asked them if there was an electrical source common to all the gauges. Their response was to check a circuit breaker for a particular bus, which as it turned out was completely normal. We certainly alerted Miami Air Traffic Control of our predicament, but told them we believed we only had an indication problem since the chance of our losing oil in all 3 engines was practically nil. As a precaution, they alerted the Air Sea Rescue with the result that a Coast Guard Falcon jet was sent to meet and escort us as we headed inbound to Miami International. Our wishful thinking that we had indeed suffered an electrical malfunction was soon to be shattered. 5 minutes after we had the indications of low oil pressure on engines 1 and 3, number 3 engine seized with a loud bang. We were left now with only the number 1 engine operating and the realization that it too would likely fail soon. We called the flight attendants to the flight deck and informed them they should prepare the passengers in the cabin for a ditching. I will always remember the look on the faces of the 3 flight attendants who came to the cockpit and the other 2 pilots. The color of their skin was stark white, as I'm sure was mine. A physician friend of mine would later tell me this was because so much adrenaline was being pumped into the bloodstream. At 9:33, we lost our final operating engine. With the aircraft now at an altitude of 13,000 feet and only our APU available, we had no chance of reaching land, unless we were somehow successful in relighting one of our 3 engines. As I mentioned earlier, there was cloud cover below, and I often thought if we had seen Bimini as we passed over it without engines, would we have entertained thoughts of dead sticking onto that 4,000-foot runway? Such an attempt would have probably been a disaster. I remember being incredibly busy at this time. I also remember having difficulty thinking clearly about tasks that needed to be accomplished. We needed to dump fuel, communicate with the passengers, flight attendants, ATC, as well as preparing for ditching. We frantically began many attempts at restarting the number 2 engine. We used the in-flight restart checklist but couldn't get the engine started. I remember yelling at Second Officer Barnes to follow the checklist exactly as it was written. When you got to the item on the checklist, which read isolation valve, the response was as required, which we erroneously took to mean leave it closed. As we descended through 4,000 feet, we were awaiting water impact. In one final attempt to restart number 2, we again turned to the relight procedure, but this time didn't use the checklist, but rather, almost out of desperation, went through the normal ground start procedure, including the opening of the same isolation valve. I remember pressing the engine start switch and seeing the green light come on as the engine RPM rose. What a feeling. At 3,000 feet, we now had sufficient power to maintain level flight and even successfully climb back up to 4. We didn't know how long the engine would produce power, and we were still some 34 miles from the airport. We deliberately chose runway 27 left so as to keep open the option of still ditching in Biscayne Bay if that ultimately became necessary. As it happened, the number 2 engine hung on in there, and at 0946 we touched down at Miami International, just 13 minutes after losing our final engine in flight. As we turned off the runway, we stopped on the adjacent taxiway so that the fire department could douse the number 1 engine with water as there was heavy smoke coming from it. We were told it would take 15 minutes or so to get a tug out to us so as to tow us back to the terminal. I told them we wanted to taxi in and get off the airplane as soon as possible. We advanced the number 2 throttle in order to begin taxi, but couldn't get any power from it. We had run out of engines again, but at least this time we were on the ground. We would later learn that by this stage, the number 2 engine had actually even less oil than either engines 1 or 3. As we were being towed to the gate, I felt the first noticeable anxiety. It was demonstrated by shaking knees and a quivering voice when making a PA announcement. This is when I first realized what we had just been through. We were met at the gate by Captain Bert Beach, the Miami Assistant Chief Pilot, and a foreman from line maintenance. The foreman made the statement to us that he knew exactly what had happened. That was the first time the word O-ring was used. We were led straight to a convened NTSB hearing. In time, it was concluded that 2 mechanics had installed the master chip detectors on all 3 engines without O-ring seals, thereby putting the lives of 172 people in grave danger. Their only discipline was to demote them to auto mechanics for a period of 30 days. Overall, we did a poor job of keeping the flight attendants and the passengers informed, and for that I take full responsibility. When we made the decision to return to Miami, we made a PA announcement that we were returning to Miami because of a minor mechanical problem and reassured them that everything was okay. We announced ditching is imminent much too early, which led the flight attendants and passengers to believe impact was only moments away. This created a high level of anxiety for a longer period of time, 9 to 10 minutes in fact, than was absolutely necessary. Our flight attendants, led by Shirley Alexio, did a superb job. In looking back, there were many things that happened that morning which, had any one of them changed, the eventual outcome may well have been a lot different. To this day, I still believe there was divine intervention in our successfully landing safely back in Miami.
An immediate post-flight examination of the aircraft's 3 engines consisted of both a visual inspection and removal of each engine's master chip detector assembly. This examination confirmed that both number 1 and 3 engines were substantially damaged, with number 2 being subsequently serviced, started and run to take off power. But it was what the investigation team noticed with regard to the master chip detectors themselves, which ultimately would explain what had happened to the L-1011. But what exactly is a chip detector, and why will each play such an important part in the story of Eastern 855? In simple terms, a chip detector is a probe, and like all probes, their function is to gather information. Each of the 3 Orby-211 engines fitted to the jet had a removable master chip detector inserted into the engine's oil system. What the detectors were designed to look for was any sign of system component breakdown or disintegration. Typically, where components start to break down, be those pumps, bearings, filters, they tend to deposit metal filings or metal chips into the free flow of engine oil. Sometimes these traces are visible to the human eye, other times only identifiable following routine laboratory analysis. In order to retrieve these suspended metal chips, that part of the detector inserted into the flow of oil is magnetized, so that when removed, any particles adhering to the detector can be subsequently collected and sent for examination. But in removing the chip detectors, the system must be designed so as to maintain its integrity, in other words, protect against leaks. In removing the detector completely, a shut-off or non-return valve satisfies this requirement. With the detector in place, this shut-off valve is unseated, and thus 2 rubber O-rings fitted into machine grooves in the body of the detector fulfill the same role. And it was the absence of these O-rings on all 3 engines that had caught the attention of the investigation team. Without these seals in place, or if the seals happen to be defective, insertion of the chip detector into the engine's oil system will unseat the check valve, and once the engine is run, with the oil system now pressurized, will result in a leak, the rate of which will be undetermined. From the outset, the investigation team were quick to establish that this is what had actually occurred, for reasons as of yet unknown, resulting in the precautionary shutdown of engine number 2 and the subsequent failures of both engines 3 and 1. The process of routine removal, examination and replacement of the chip detectors was governed by a detailed maintenance schedule drawn up by the engine manufacturer. In the case of the RB211, this interval had been initially set at 250 flight hours. However, in September of 1981, just over a year and a half before 855's fateful flight over the South Atlantic, Rolls-Royce had revised the schedule downward by a not insignificant factor of 10. This new inspection schedule, to be repeated now at intervals of only 25 hours, was made following a meeting attended by all relevant parties, manufacturer, regulator and airlines operating the engine type, where operational experience and difficulties were discussed, some of which had resulted in in-flight failures. In the context of Eastern Airlines itself, prior to the introduction of this revised schedule in September 81, the airline had decided, as was its prerogative, to instead inspect and replace the detectors as each aircraft in the fleet was scheduled for a routine A-check, an interval of not 250 hours, but rather a far more conservative 90, with the aforementioned O-ring seals, although inspected, only being replaced if found to be defective or damaged. Following the schedule revision of September 81 with its introduction of the new 25-hour inspection interval, Eastern had again decided to act in a more conservative manner, with the airline subsequently setting its own in-house inspection interval at not the recommended 25 hours, but rather 22. It was envisaged that this more conservative interval would coincide with an aircraft's scheduled overnight visit to one of the many Eastern Line maintenance stations across the network, which had the capability and resources to perform such an inspection. Specifically, these were the airline's facilities at Atlanta, JFK New York, Boston, Newark, and of course Miami itself. Eastern's procedures stated that after a master chip detector had been removed from an engine by one of the airline's mechanics, it was to be inspected by a company technical field representative who was tasked with evaluating the amount and type of metal particles present, if any. Where a probe was found to be significantly contaminated with metal particles, the detector was to be sent to the company's laboratory facilities for further analysis. Either way, the results were to be recorded for each engine, with the field representative then tasked with cleaning any probes still in his possession, and in the case of the Miami facility in particular, returning the entire detector assembly to a dedicated cabinet in the foreman's office, for their ultimate reuse in other engines across the Eastern fleet. With the frequency at which these detectors were now being inspected and replaced, the company's engineering department estimated that more than 100,000 master chip detectors had been changed between October 1981 and the date of the accident, meaning that on average, any given company mechanic would have realistically undertaken this relatively minor procedure perhaps 100 times or more. The point being made here is that removal and inspection of the engine's chip detectors was a familiar and regularly undertaken task by all of the company's maintenance personnel. In the context of Eastern's Flight 855, the accident aircraft, logged on the US registry as November 334 Echo Alpha, arrived into Miami International the previous evening, that being May 4th, 1983, and was subsequently parked up overnight. For Eastern's procedures, it was the responsibility of the foreman overseeing that night's number 3 shift to ensure compliance and completion of the scheduled work card tasks which had been assigned to the aircraft, in addition to actioning any outstanding open defects in the aircraft's technical log. Specifically, the completion of work card number 7204, which related to the routine inspection of the engine chip detectors, was delegated to 2 mechanics under his supervision. Before examining the specific events which subsequently transpired that evening in Miami, it's worth noting that work card 7204 came with its own little bit of history attached. Back in December 81, about a year and a half before the accident flight, and coincidentally about the same time the detector's inspection interval had been revised, Eastern had experienced 3 separate in-flight engine shutdowns, all the result of significant engine oil leaks. In order to mitigate against any further such occurrences, the airline's engineering department had issued a written special training procedure, identified as STP-49 of 81, which coincided with the revision to Work Card 7204 and was intended to correct line maintenance problems which had been caused as a result of improper installation of engine master chip detectors and subsequent loss of engine oil. The text of the revised card mandated that the O-rings be replaced at each inspection, a requirement which heretofore hadn't existed. Additionally, following reinstallation of the detector, maintenance personnel were directed to motor the engine. This motoring of the engine required engagement of the starting motor in order to rotate the engine, thus pressurising the oil system so that any potential leaks post reinstallation of the detectors could be identified and remedied. The airline required that these special training procedures be posted in prominent bulletin boards in the communal areas of the relevant maintenance facilities, and also retained in 4 ring binders easily accessible at the foreman's desk. Foremen, lead mechanics and mechanics were collectively all required to read these publications, with foremen expected to ensure that those technicians in their charge were actively implementing any procedural changes which these bulletins may have introduced. The significant takeaway, therefore, was the fact that as far back as December 81, a year and a half before the accident flight, Eastern had identified a connection between incorrect master chip detector installation and potential engine oil leaks. And so it was against this background that the 2 mechanics assigned the task of inspecting the master chip detectors set about their work in the early hours of May 5th, about 7.5 hours before 8:55's departure to Nassau. Specifically, at about 1:30 a.m, one of the 2 mechanics assigned to the job went to the designated cabinet in the foreman's office in order to requisition 3 new serviceable master chip detector assemblies, in anticipation of replacing the 3 that were currently fitted to the aircraft. Both mechanics testified that they had always previously obtained the master chip detectors from the foreman's office, and that when requisitioned, the relevant O-rings were already fitted. This morning, however, upon inspection, the cabinet was found to be empty, forcing the mechanic to instead proceed to general stores in order to get what they needed. Importantly, he later testified that this was the first time that he had ever done so, and that on drawing the 3 detector assemblies from stores, he recalled that each was packaged in a sealed semi-transparent plastic bag with the serviceable parts tag attached. Both mechanics then drove to the aircraft's location, where they divided their assigned workload. Due to the wing engines being easily accessible from the ground, the mechanic who had drawn the detectors from stores decided to service these engines, namely number 1 and 3, whilst the second mechanic secured a forklift in order to reach the higher number 2 engine. In servicing the wing-mounted engines, the first mechanic recalled that he had used the headlights of their truck to illuminate the area of the engine's oil service panel, given that ambient lighting on the ramp wasn't particularly good. He stated that he had worked the night shift for the previous number of months, and that these general working conditions were the norm. He recalled firstly going to engine number 1 and having to place his hands some 4 to 6 inches or 10 to 15 centimetres inside the service panel in order to locate and subsequently remove the installed chip detector, which he was forced to do by feel alone, as the detector's location and the relatively small opening which the service panel afforded meant that he simply wasn't able to see what he was actually doing. He further testified that he hadn't actually examined the replacement detectors before installing them to see if the required O-rings were in place. He didn't believe that there was any need to, given the fact that the packaging which housed the detectors had a serviceable tag attached, and as such, he had simply assumed that they were. After all, on every other occasion when replacement detectors were requisitioned from the foreman's office, the O-rings were always in place, so why would he expect circumstances to be any different now? The second mechanic concurred. Based on feel alone, the first mechanic stated that he was unable to tell whether the O-rings were installed or not, so having completed the removal of the old detector and reinstallation of the new one, he proceeded to engine number 3 and repeated the process. The second mechanic, who was now positioned at the number 2 engine, noted that there was an integral light located inside the engine cowling. However, that said, he had still needed an additional flashlight in order to see the engine parts clearly. The chip detector which he was looking for had been located directly over his head, So with one hand he removed the old detector, while at the same time, with a rag in the other, he reached up to catch the dripping oil. He then installed the new detector, which he had placed on the ledge of the cowling, before placing the old assembly into the now empty plastic packaging. By his own admission, he too had failed to inspect the replacement detector before its installation, even though he admitted that he was indeed responsible for ensuring that the master chip detector had been configured properly before it was inserted into the engine's oil system. With all three detectors now having been replaced, the first mechanic, the individual who had serviced engines 1 and 3, went to the cockpit in order to motor over the engines, which he did for all three for a period of approximately 10 seconds each. Each engine was then re-inspected in order to establish if replacement of the detectors had resulted in any unwanted oil leaks. Unbeknownst to either mechanic at the time, although the detectors routinely collected from the cabinet in the foreman's office did come with new O-rings already fitted, those requisitioned from general stores did not, and as such, all three master chip detectors had now been fitted minus these necessary O-rings. Under such circumstances, the subsequent motoring of the aircraft's three engines should have revealed this fact, as pressurized oil should have leaked past the detector, being discharged overboard from a collector drain mast. This would have been noticed as a wet oil patch under each of the respective engines, but surprisingly this hadn't happened. What nobody knew at the time was that although the engines were required to be motored, the duration of this motoring had not been stipulated on the work card, and so the 10 seconds which the mechanics had settled on had been a completely arbitrary and totally subjective call on their part. But the truth was that 10 seconds simply wasn't long enough to raise the system's pressure to a value where a potential leak would have been apparent. And so, although they had completed the procedure as stipulated, they simply hadn't motored the engine for long enough, meaning that with no evidence of leaks being present, the task of replacing all three master chip detectors had been signed off as successfully completed. When I say signed off, this is actually more than just a turn of phrase. Quite literally, each item of the procedure once completed had to be physically signed for on the work card by the mechanic who had actually completed the task. What was of note, and would become highly relevant to the subsequent investigation, was the fact that, despite the two mechanics having between them serviced the three engines, the entire work card had been signed off by just one individual, meaning that he alone had certified the work as being completed satisfactorily, despite the fact that some of this work he simply hadn't overseen. Worse again was the fact that in certifying each item on the work card as having been completed, he had made a declaration that all the required O-rings had been correctly fitted to the new detectors. And this simply wasn't the case. The three chip detectors which had been removed from the aircraft were returned to the technical field representative, so he could inspect each detector for metal particle contamination. After the inspection, contrary to established procedures, one of the mechanics had returned all three detectors to the general storeroom instead of leaving them with the field representative for him to deposit back in the foreman's cabinet. In their subsequent testimonies, both mechanics stated that they had received no special training in relation to the requirements of work card 7204. They had never seen STP 49 of 81, this despite the fact that this specific information bulletin had been in circulation for almost a year and a half before the accident flight. Aside from one memo from their general foreman, they were unaware of previous problems involving master chip detectors. This despite the fact that since the initial revision of work card 7204 back in September 81, which mandated the replacement of O-rings with every inspection, there had been 13 incidents across the Eastern L1011 fleet of oil loss due to master chip detector or O-ring seal problems, 8 of which had been directly traced back to maintenance practices at the Miami facility. The content of the memo, however, had cautioned mechanics against not strictly adhering to the procedures as outlined in Work Card 7204. They were both aware that Work Card 7204 required that the O-rings be replaced, but they had assumed that the master chip detectors drawn from the general stores already had new O-rings fitted, because those previously requisitioned from the foreman's cabinet always did. They had assumed that someone on the day shift or the technical field representative himself had previously replaced the O-rings and readied the new chip detectors for installation. Incredibly, despite knowing that the procedures as outlined in Workcard 7204 called for the O-rings to be replaced, neither of the two mechanics had ever done so. Despite this, both accepted that they were ultimately responsible for ensuring that the new seals had been fitted before fitting the detectors back into the oil system. And finally, both had genuinely believed that in motoring the engine for a duration of 10 seconds, this was sufficient to assess whether any oil leaks had developed. Yet in examining the events of those early hours of the morning of May 5th, it would be wrong to focus exclusively on the actions of the two mechanics alone. What of the wider maintenance structure in Miami? Let's not forget the fact that 8 of the 13 related oil loss incidents which had occurred between September 81 and the date of the accident were flights which had undergone overnight maintenance at the Miami maintenance facility itself. The general foreman of the night shift stated in his post-accident testimony that he personally had been aware of several incidents involving oil leaks resulting from either missing or defective O-ring seals and/or master chip detectors which had fallen out in flight. With its publication, he testified that he had personally reviewed the content of STP 49 of 81 and had subsequently discussed its implications with the foreman in his charge. Without pursuing the matter any further, he had assumed, following this discussion with the shift's foremen, that they themselves had subsequently disseminated the same information to the mechanics on the line. Despite testifying that he was aware of the workcard's requirement to replace the O-rings with each inspection, when asked if he knew of any mechanic who routinely did this, he said that he didn't. Furthermore, he said that he was aware that mechanics usually requisitioned the replacement master chip detectors from the foreman's office, with the O-rings already installed, but at the same time was unable to explain how or who actually did this. On completion of the replacement process, he said that he expected mechanics to motor the engines until oil pressure peaked, but had no figure in mind as to exactly how long that should be. The duration of this motoring period was formally set at 30 seconds, with a further revision of Workcard 7204 on May 17, 1983, some 12 days after the accident flight. Indicative perhaps of the communication inefficiencies within Eastern, which the investigation team was now starting to uncover. When asked only one day prior to this revision if he knew of any proposed procedural changes in the pipeline, the general foreman replied that he did not. The senior line manager of the Miami maintenance base was also interviewed as part of the investigation. In his position, as well as being the general foreman's direct superior, it was he who had ultimate responsibility for the 3 work shifts at the facility, a combined workforce of approximately 18 foremen and 140 mechanics. He testified that prior to the accident flight of May 5, 1983, he had had some knowledge of prior incidents involving oil leaks across Eastern's fleet of L-1011s, but was unsure as to what the number actually was. Incredibly, attesting that most maintenance managers were likewise most probably ignorant of the exact magnitude of the problem. He also stated that he had had no conversations with the FAA or the Federal Aviation Administration concerning master chip detectors, O-ring seals, or Eastern's maintenance problems in relation to these matters until after the accident. In relation to the revised motoring times post-accident, despite the fact that these changes were only introduced on the 17th of May, as the investigation had progressed, these proposed changes had been discussed widely in advance of this implementation date, and the line manager stated that he was at a loss as to how the general foreman in question had not been aware of these developments. After the first recorded incidents of improper installation of the master chip detectors, in and around the period of September to November 1981, the Director of Line Maintenance met with the Principal Inspector assigned by the FAA to oversee Eastern's day-to-day maintenance operations, in an effort to discuss and resolve these issues. He was advised by the FAA inspector to take whatever corrective action was necessary in order to prevent any reoccurrence, or risk having changes imposed upon him by the regulatory authority. It was as a direct result of this meeting that the revision to Work Card 7204 was introduced in December of the same year, that same revision which mandated the replacement of the detector's O-rings with each inspection. He testified that he was aware of the previous oil leak incidents, and was of the understanding that the circumstances surrounding each related to the improper installation of the master chip detector, circumstances which he believed were widely known across the organisation. He stated that he had personally reviewed each of the 13 incidents which had occurred since September 81, and in each and every case had been satisfied that the work procedures themselves had proven adequate, but instead believed that it was the actual implementation of the required procedures which had proven problematic. In his defence, he attested that the more recent incidents had certainly highlighted the fact that confusion still existed with regard to procedural implementation of Work Card 7204, but that he was confident, given the revisions made as of May 17th, that these ongoing issues would be addressed. From the FAA's perspective, they likewise concluded that the procedures pertaining to Work Card 7204 were essentially robust, and that the historic incidents of oil leaks and improper installation of the master chip detectors were caused by the actions of individual mechanics, rather than a larger systemic failure on the part of the airline. As a result, other than the revision made to the Work Card proceedings as of May 17th, 12 days after the accident flight, where the motoring time had been definitively stipulated as 30 seconds, they deemed that no other action was necessary. The regulator thus believing that they had no other direct involvement other than to ensure the successful completion of the investigation and the ultimate retraining or disciplining of those mechanics involved, should the investigation conclude that this be the most appropriate course of action. The regulator did, however, instruct their on-site inspectors to keep a close eye on how Work Card 7204 was being implemented, with the Miami Flight Standards District Office initiating a program to observe the general manner in which work cards were being issued and their associated procedures fulfilled. These inspections were scheduled in such a way so as to encompass all shifts at the maintenance facility. As for Eastern Airlines itself, the company commenced an inspection of all master chip detectors retained in general stores across the maintenance network. Where detectors were found with O-ring seals fitted, these seals were removed, ensuring that from this point forward there would be no ambiguity as to the status of seals on requisition chip detectors, forcing the line mechanics to follow verbatim the procedure as outlined on the work card, that being that they, and they alone, be responsible for the fitting of these seals and the overall integrity of the entire assembly. In addition, an in-house training video was prepared in order to demonstrate the proper installation of the master chip detector assembly and O-ring seals, while at the same time all foremen were tasked with policing the mechanics in their charge, that they read and implement procedural changes promulgated by way of the various in-house engineering bulletins and publications. And finally, to guard against the chip detector itself actually falling out, in the latter part of November 83, almost 7 months after the accident flight, Eastern modified the installation of the detector to incorporate for the first time a grasshopper pin, which physically couldn't be installed unless the chip detector was properly in place, and whose installation physically locked the detector in place, thus preventing it from inadvertently coming loose and falling off the aircraft. The upshot was that as a result of all these new measures, Eastern's L-1011 fleet suffered no further in-flight shutdowns as a result of master chip detector installation or O-ring problems. Yet that said, the fact that these shortcomings had not been experienced by other US operators of the L-1011 type in itself spoke volumes for the culture and practices existing at the time in Eastern, particularly in the context of their maintenance facility at Miami. Knowing what they did about the status of the master chip detectors and the absence of the required O-ring seals, when investigators turned their attention to events on the flight deck and the actions of the crew that day, they expressed a level of surprise that engines 3 and 1 had continued to indicate an oil level of 15 quarts, while at the same time the number 2 was only indicating 8. Only 8 minutes later, the oil quantity indications for both number 3 and 1 had dropped to 0, and their respective low oil pressure lights had illuminated. This, they believed, indicated that either there had been a rapid coincidental loss of oil from both engines 3 and 1 after the number 2 engine had been shut down, or more likely, that there had actually been far less in the system than the 15 quarts indicated on the gauges. They accepted that normal fluctuations of the oil quantity gauges, especially during the dynamic phases of climb and descent, may well have provided Barnes with an erroneous overview of the system status. However, since he had said himself that the oil quantity gauges could possibly vary by up to 3 quarts, they nonetheless believed that he should have been more concerned that the actual quantity of oil in the other engines could potentially have been as low as 12 quarts. Once the aircraft had been cleared to return to Miami and began to climb again back towards flight level 200, Barnes was again occupied with cockpit checklist activities. He stated that in the 4 to 5 minutes immediately after the number 2 engine was shut down, he hadn't noticed any declining oil indications on either engines 3 or 1, up until the illumination of the respective low oil pressure lights. The NTSB accepted his statement as factual. However, not for the first time they were somewhat critical of his failure to actively monitor the engine systems for what they interpreted to be a relatively long period of time, without specifically saying so in the final report. There is nonetheless an inference that given the jet's closer geographical proximity to Nassau, had Bodie and Thompson been aware of the depleting oil levels earlier, they may well have declared an emergency and continued on to their destination. After Barnes had announced that the oil quantity levels on all 3 engines was now 0, the crew had only about 5 to 6 minutes in which to analyse the situation before the number 3 engine flamed out. Their initial reaction was to level the aircraft, now climbing through 16,000 feet, as they entertained the possibility that they were experiencing indication problems with all 3 oil pressure gauges at the same time. This assumption was fostered by their collective belief that the possibility of total simultaneous oil depletion on all 3 engines was virtually non-existent. Indeed, for what it's worth, ask any of the topical AI engines at the moment to quote the exact mathematical probability of such an event happening, and the odds expressed are of the magnitude of 1 event per 10 to the power of 21 flight hours, that being once in 10 quintillion continuous flight hours, a time frame so vast it's actually longer than the current age of the universe. No wonder they were skeptical. As well as believing that the probability of a triple engine failure was so remote as to be almost non-existent, the crew would also have reasoned that instrumentation malfunction was, in contrast, a fairly realistic possibility. Furthermore, and of significance, was the fact that none of the 3 crew members had any prior knowledge of incidents relating to total oil loss as a result of incorrectly installed master chip detectors or missing O-rings. Consequently, their first reaction was to reach out to their maintenance colleagues back in Miami, in an effort to establish whether the potential interruption of a single power source could possibly be affecting all of their oil system indications at the very same time. While this interaction was ongoing, the number 3 engine flamed out. The subsequent investigation would later show that the gradual failure of the engine's bearings had caused the high-pressure compressor assembly to actually move out of alignment, resulting in failure of the gearbox drive to the fuel pump and the ultimate starvation of fuel to the engine's combustion chamber. To their horror, it appeared, however unlikely, that their oil predicament was real, very real. The decision to climb to flight level 200 en route back to Miami wasn't questioned by the investigation team. Indeed, such a course of action would have been completely routine under the circumstances. However, with the required increase in power which this climb called for, the law of unintended consequences had come into play. The NTSB believed that the selection of climb power on engines number 1 and 3 may very well have contributed to an increased rate of oil depletion. This increased rate of oil loss would ultimately not only result in the loss of number 3, but also the number 1 just 5 minutes later. It's possible that a landing in Nassau could have been made before the loss of the 2 remaining engines. However, because the actual oil loss rate and the time needed to land in the Bahamas was unknown, the investigation team couldn't definitively establish exactly when the engines would have failed out. Had the crew decided to continue, or alternatively, had they elected not to climb while en route back to Miami? The number 2 engine, although suffering some internal damage, hadn't flamed out, because it was shut down early enough in the emergency with the first indication of oil pressure and quantity problems. Undoubtedly, the investigation team believed, it too would have failed for the very same reasons as numbers 3 and 1, had the crew delayed in their initial actions to shut it down. Post-flight examination had determined that the remaining oil in the number 2 engine was actually less than the quantities which existed post-flight in either engines 1 or 3. This fact indicated that the number 2 was very close to failure as the L-1011 touched down on Miami International's runway 27 left. The crew and passengers of Eastern 855 had had a lucky escape, but it was the NTSB's examination of how Bodie, Thompson and Barnes had finally managed to relight the number 2 engine and save the day, which revealed just how lucky 855 had been and how close their planned ditching had actually come to being a reality. This point was addressed by Thompson during his earlier deposition. In completing the engine shutdown checklist for the number 2 engine, Barnes had correctly closed the associated isolation valve in order that the engine not be back-pressured by pneumatic power from an alternative source, be that the wing-mounted engines or the APU. However, as the L-1011 descended powerless through 4,000 feet at a speed of 250 knots, a quick look at the aircraft's in-flight restart envelope would show that in order to attempt an engine relight under these conditions, the engine's starting motor, which is pneumatically driven, would have to be used in order to spin the engine to an RPM which would support enough compression for combustion and successful light-up. With all previous attempts at relighting the number 2 engine, the isolation valve had been left closed, with the crew believing that the forward momentum of the aircraft itself would rotate the engine compressor sufficiently to provide the compression needed for successful ignition and light-up. But the fact was that the aircraft had never been travelling fast enough for this to actually be achieved, meaning that any such attempt at a windmilling start would inevitably prove futile. In desperation, however, with their final attempt, Thompson's comments would suggest that the isolation valve, more by accident than design, was this time opened, thus allowing pneumatic air from the APU to reach the number 2 engine's starting motor. With the starter now rotating the engine, sufficient compression was achieved in order to facilitate a successful light-up and avert disaster. The failure of Eastern to specify a minimum motoring time when this task was specifically listed on work card 7204 was, the investigation team believed, a deficiency in maintenance procedures, and indicated that this particular aspect of the work card had never been thoroughly researched in advance. Without doubt, had this motoring time been more accurately defined, the fact that the detectors had been fitted without the necessary O-rings would have been identified prior to the aircraft being released back into service. With regard to the line mechanics themselves, their failure to correctly complete the relatively simple task of reinstalling the master chip detector and their failure to follow the procedures of work card 7204 in its entirety was, they believed, indicative of unprofessional work practices. While in no way trying to exonerate their actions, the final report did, however, draw attention to several factors which may go some way towards explaining their behaviour. Firstly, the very frequency with which these detectors were being replaced was perhaps in itself a contributing factor. The task of requisition, removal and subsequent replacement was not a significantly complicated matter. As such, there was a suggestion that the routineness of operation may well have led to unquestioning, non-attentive action on the part of the mechanics concerned, specifically with regard to the circumstances pertaining to Eastern 855. This may well have biased the mechanics in making their erroneous assumption that the O-rings had already been fitted. Indeed, this brings us on to the second factor, which may well have been significant. The master chip detectors had heretofore always been requisitioned from the foreman's office, with the replacement O-ring seals having already been fitted. Despite this, the text of work card 7204 specifically stated that the mechanics assigned the work card were the only individuals authorised to be fitting these seals. The fact that nobody had sought to question this practice had, over time, allowed this procedural deviation to become normalised, and as the 3 detectors were being replaced night after night, the acceptance of this procedural deviation was continuously being reinforced. Furthermore, because the text of Work Card 7204 had specifically required that the on-site mechanic replace the O-rings himself, this accepted procedural deviation meant that these same mechanics were also now routinely signing off this work as having been done by them, when in fact, more often than not, this actually wasn't the case. A third factor, which may have been relevant in the grand scheme of things, was the fact that the detectors, when requisitioned from general stores, all came with serviceability tags attached. Per their own subsequent testimonies, the mechanics each attested that this fact alone had led them to falsely believe that the parts were ready to be installed, and that, as had always been the case previously, the by now infamous O-rings had already been replaced. As such, they had let their guard down and failed to check for themselves. To add insult to injury, with the mechanics failing to check for the presence of the O-rings, there was always the possibility that their absence may have been accidentally noticed during the installation process. However, as luck would have it, the physical difficulty in assessing the detector, compounded by the poor environmental lighting on the ramp at the time, meant that this last chance to mitigate their collective failings never materialised. With regard to the general level of supervision and managerial oversight, the NTSB identified as the most significant shortcoming the lack of quality control at general foreman level, as it was his responsibility to detect and correct any improper implementation of Work Card 7204. The general foreman had stated definitively in his testimony that the mechanics tasked with completing the items of the work card were solely responsible for replacing the relevant O-rings, yet at the same time acknowledged that he didn't actually know any individuals who had actually done so, nor did he know how the replacement seals had come to be installed in those detectors stored in the foreman's office. All these facts combined pointed to the fact that he was aware that published procedures were not being followed scrupulously, yet he had taken no action to correct this fact, or indeed make any effort to establish why such procedural deviations were happening in the first instance. The NTSB couldn't understand why the general foreman had failed to correct the master chip detector installation problem, after he had become aware of some of the earlier incidents involving missing or defective O-ring seals. Indeed, he had written a memo on the subject 2 months before the accident flight, and should have ensured that his foremen and mechanics were provided with adequate guidance and training in order to correctly perform the items of Work Card 7204. Furthermore, his chosen method of disseminating training bulletins and procedural changes by way of postings on notice boards and their filing in ring binders was deemed to be inadequate, particularly in light of the fact that there was no follow-up system in place in order to monitor which, if any, of his mechanics were actually reading and implementing the revisions. These supervisory shortcomings, however, weren't the general foreman's alone. It was apparent from the testimonies of more senior Eastern Airline officials that the problems involving master chip detector installations were well known at all levels within the maintenance structure, above that of the foreman and mechanic level. Thus, the failure of the company's middle management to correct these issues wasn't as a result of poor reporting procedures, but rather it appeared that the maintenance management system was deficient in its ability to use the information at hand. With every incident which had occurred on the line, Eastern's maintenance management had investigated the circumstances and concluded that the problem had been with the personnel involved and not the procedures themselves. Consequently, no initiatives were taken by upper or middle management in order to either improve the written work procedures of Work Card 7204 or to publicise the occurrence of these incidents in order to better educate the line mechanics and encourage them to be more diligent in the execution of their work. Instead, the incidents were addressed through individual disciplinary actions and mandated remedial training, neither approach being successful in resolving the problem. The significance of this lack of effective analysis and management was underscored by the fact that since the accident flight of May 5, 1983, no master chip detector issue has resulted in the in-flight shutdown of any RB211 engine. With regard to the regulatory authority itself, the FAA had conducted no systematic analysis of the continuing problem. Instead, their inspectors addressed each incident as an individual isolated event, rather than a wider systemic deficiency, and relied on Eastern Airlines to discipline and/or retrain those mechanics involved. The NTSB thus believed that given the number of incidents being reported and the fact that these reports were coming in even after modification of the applicable work card, the FAA should have been alert to the fact that any solution to the detector installation problems was going to require more than just the reiteration of existing procedures. But in their wisdom, they had failed to provide any constructive oversight. The various measures which were taken following the accident of Eastern Flight 855 proved that a resolution to the problem was indeed possible, and that being the case, such corrective action should have been implemented well before 855 departed Miami International on that fateful morning of May 5th, 1983. Thus, the investigation team of the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the probable cause of the accident was the omission of all the O-ring seals on the master chip detector assemblies, leading to the loss of lubrication and damage to the aircraft's 3 engines, as a result of a failure of mechanics to follow the established and proper procedures for the installation of master chip detectors in the engine lubrication system, the repeated failure of supervisory personnel to require mechanics to comply strictly with the prescribed installation procedures, and the failure of Eastern Airlines management to assess adequately the significance of similar previous occurrences and to act effectively to institute corrective action. This was the full story of Eastern Airlines Flight 855, the flight which very nearly never made it home.